Hello, everybody. Dr. Yates again. I want to continue talking about Homer's The Odyssey, and I want to focus this time on just a few thoughts about the composition and transmission of this ancient Greek epic. The Odyssey was originally composed in what we call Homeric Greek around the 8th or 7th century BCE. And by the mid 6th century BCE, the Odyssey had become part of the Greek literary canon and a part of Greek culture. Now, most scholars date the writing or composition of the Odyssey to about roughly between 675 to 725 BCE. So while in antiquity the authorship of Homer wasn't really questioned, but contemporary scholarship here in the 21st century has questioned it and basically has taken the viewpoint that both the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed independently, and that the stories that were put into the Iliad and the Odyssey had originally been part of a very long oral tradition. And so we don't really know who first created the stories in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's really difficult to date the beginnings of these two epics, because even though we basically assume that Homer was the author, they were performed on a regular basis by rhapsodes, or itinerant entertainers, for lack of a better term. They were traveling poets who would recite this oral tradition to communities and whoever they encountered. And so because there were so many of these for several hundred years, okay, it's really, really difficult to pinpoint exactly when these two works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed originally. Now, as you can imagine, the intention for these poems was to be performed by these rhapsodes. It was an oral performance, not a written performance. There was widespread illiteracy, and the individuals who went about spreading or performing the Odyssey and the Iliad were more about being heard than by being read, shall we say, by expecting their audiences to have read the material before the performance. Typically, because of this, they were performed, like I said, by rhapsodes who are professional performers of epic poetry, but also they were performed by a skilled oral epic poem or poet that was called an aeodus. So we have the rhapsodies, which is a group of these itinerant performers, but within that group we also have the aeodus, which is someone who is highly skilled at the performance of epics. And again, both of these types of performers were itinerant. They traveled throughout Greece for several hundred years before either epic, the Iliad or the Odyssey, was finally written down. Now, typically, after it was written down, we can kind of see this. But the Odyssey is composed of 12,109 lines. And just like the Iliad, it was written in dactylic hexameter. We often call dactylic hexameter Homeric hexameter. And like with the Iliad, dactylic hexameter means simply that each line of the poem is made up of 6 feet. In other words, 6 metrical units. A foot is comprised of an unstressed and a stressed syllable. Okay. Now, typically, we call that an iamb, but even metrical feet can be shaped differently, and we have a variety of metrical feet. So while each foot at its base has these 2 syllables, an unstressed followed by a stressed, a poet can do things and create different kinds of feet. And so that's why we have dactylic hexameter, because each foot, each metrical unit is a dactyl, where we have a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. So for the Iliad and the Odyssey, the foot, the poetic or metrical foot, is really 3 syllables throughout these works, these 2 works. So remember that dactyl is 3 syllables. It's a stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed syllables. And because we have 6 units of them, it's hexameter, because hex means 6. Okay, so that's and it, like I mentioned, that goes right along with the Iliad. Okay, now the original work, as I hope I've said, was orally transmitted, and so it may not have been constructed into 24 books. But when it was finally written down, it was written down likely in columns on rolls of papyrus. And so it could have been some kind of animal skin like parchment or vellum, but probably it was written in papyrus. So you would have, on a sheet of papyrus, you have two columns, and then these lines would be written down. And so the poem actually, in that sense, made up 24 individual rolls. And so we now talk about the book, or the poem, being 24 books long. because it refers to those 24 individual lines. Now, the transmission, okay, we've talked about the composition, how it was composed, but the transmission of that long oral tradition of the poem is a bit complicated, but I'll try to shrink it down to just a handful of points for you. It's generally agreed that the quote-unquote date of Homer should refer to that moment in history when the oral tradition became a written text. Okay, so when we're talking about dates, such as 635 or 725, that time span in between is what we refer to as the period in which that oral tradition was written down and began to be presented in a written physical text. So, as you can imagine, it's tough to really pinpoint when that happened. So we have a range that we're pretty sure the poem was written down after this long, several hundred year long tradition of it being orally presented throughout Greece. Until the 15th century, all of the volumes, all 24 books of the Odyssey that were in circulation were all written in handwritten Greek. And it wasn't until 1488 that the first printed version was produced in Florence, Italy. And it was still in Greek, but that was the first time we have a printed edition, you might say, or a printed version of the Odyssey. Now, the earliest translations that we have of the Odyssey appeared in different places in Europe during the 6th century. Now, originally, the language, while it was Greek, we can get a little bit more specific, and we can say that its original language is what we call an Ionic Greek dialect. It's a very special dialect of Greek, and so that the earliest translations were in this original Ionic Greek dialect. And as time went along, of course, it was translated a number of other languages: Italian, French, finally English, etc. But in a nutshell, that's kind of how the Odyssey was composed and then transmitted. And there's a lot more in the story of that. And it'd be an awesome topic for a paper, by the way, if anybody wants to try that. But I think, that's the high points of it. They, went through hundreds of years of being an oral performance of this epic poem by Aeodas and Rhapsodes, and then finally, in the 6th and 7th centuries BCE, it was finally written down in a text of 24 papyrus rolls. And then that was finally printed for the first time in 1488 in Florence, Italy. All right. Hope that made sense. I find it fascinating myself, but so if you have any questions, by all means, always let me know. And we'll see you next time. So long.